So I'm Steve Myers. I'm a Nieman Fellow this year, and I most recently was the editor of a nonprofit investigative news site in New Orleans called The Lens. I've been doing government accountability work in some form or another for about 20 years.
And welcome. I'm Ellen Klas. I am the Miami Herald's Tallahassee bureau chief. I cover state government and politics out of the capital of Florida, and I have focused on and do focus exclusively on accountability and investigative reporting. And so I'm really excited that so many of you have chosen to dig a little deeper on public records with us today. So thanks. Let me just start out, if you guys can imagine, you're covering, let's say, your student government's executive board meeting, or the Board of Governors meeting, a school board meeting, city council meeting, and you see somebody right before a vote pull out his iPhone or her iPhone, start texting. How many of you guys would want to know what that text is? How many of you would make a public records request for it? This is something that is likely in many states a public record. Now, they may not turn it over because it may be that they're just texting their spouse or friend, what's about something personal. Or it could be that there's someone in the audience that's delivering them some information and they want to know whether this should influence their vote. So that's one way I want you guys to start thinking about public records.
So as we get started here, helps to turn it on. Just briefly, has anyone, I can define public records, but I don't want to be too basic. Does everyone know what we mean when we're talking about public records? Raise your hand if you don't, and I'm happy to explain it. You're all set? Everyone knows. And have you filed public records requests before? No, raise your hand if you have not. Okay, good. Well, by the end of this session, you're going to have lots of ideas for what to do. So a lot of times in the work that we do as investigative journalists, we have it's hard to get people to talk to us, and so we rely heavily on documents and records of any kind from public agencies. And so here are some of the reasons that we rely so heavily on them, that they basically prove and they show people really what's going on rather than having people describe that. And I know that, for instance, in a story we did recently where we were able to show messages describing how people were recruited to attend public meetings, and that let people into the story, and that way they were able to see exactly what was going on rather than have people tell them. And it's a really good way to hold the powerful accountable to find out exactly if they're fulfilling campaign promises or doing what they said that they would do. It's an excellent way to observe deliberations because people do so much over email. Being able to look at their emails, it's like being in the room sometimes. And I can show you an example later in which the documents we got, it was as close as you could be to being in the room or on that conference call to see what was really going on. These are the ways we find out about sweetheart deals and find out about conflicts of interest. And this is the primary way that we can get data on things where, the government is saying one thing is happening, but we really don't know. Public records is a way to get it. So it is like one of the most important skills that any investigative journalist would use, but really any reporter, it has to be, sort of one of your primary tools.
So the places to look are endless, right? And as you guys know, since you're all at schools, let's talk a little bit. Frank Lamonte talked a little bit about the Jean Cleary Disclosure Act, so I won't go into detail about that. But remember what he said, and remember that it doesn't hurt to start looking at things like police incident reports, school student conduct board hearings, and things that everyone's talking about right now. Standardized testing. Are there complaints filed? Are there incidents that have emerged? One of the things that I think it's always a good idea is if you're a reporter, always have a public records request out at some time, because things take a long time to get, so it never hurts to just send. It doesn't cost any money to make a request. So there are other places you can look at. many government agencies actually keep a log of their public records requests. Now, sometimes people say that this is how news organizations find out what their competitors are doing, but on the other hand, you can also find out if there's been lawyers that are asking for documents that are discovery, that kind of thing. And of course, you know that if a public official keeps a calendar and he's not telling you all that he's doing, you could at least ask for the calendar and schedule. Everyone knows about emails. Public emails, whether, it doesn't matter where, if someone is doing public business, they can be doing an email on their private account and it's still a public record. It is if they're doing doing the business of the public, it doesn't matter what the medium, it's still a public record. So when you make the request, you're going to make sure you ask for all public, public and private accounts relating to the issue. Contracts, legal agreements, budgets. It's often, sometimes people will be giving a presentation. Maybe the athletic department is giving a presentation to some of the boosters. Ask for their PowerPoint. Another thing, if you're in the looking at an elected official and you want to find out a little bit more about how their email habits are or their internet habits, their search history is a public record. Government-owned aircraft records. Obviously, if there's a elected official who's using a state aircraft, you could ask for those records. And as we mentioned, text messages. And in many investigative reporting stories that we've done, we've often asked for the video and body cam from police. We did some reporting on juvenile justice detention facilities in Florida, and it took us a really long time, but it was the video from those some of the abusive behavior that ultimately made the story. So those are all things you can consider.
So in terms of public and private email accounts, is that what got Hillary Clinton and Vice President Mike Pence in trouble? Is the fact that they had private email servers that they didn't disclose, or is that a totally different?
Okay, so that is the server. We're talking about email communication. So there's DonaldTrump.com, or the real, if he sends emails, there's going to be emails on his public account. But you also want to find out what is the private account. So you want to ask for any email exchange relating to the public business on his private account. And you may not even know what that private account is, but put it in your request. So I'm talking about the email accounts themselves. And it's the same with iMessages, their WhatsApp messages, all those things.
And we're talking about all the things that are public. There are some variations in state law, so
Right.
it's possible that there was a court ruling against something. The laws are written differently in different states, but I've done public records work in about 5 or 6 different states, and there are a lot of similarities across. So it's possible that in one state, a browser history might not be public in some way, but maybe the part related business would be. There are some variations on that. So we can't say unequivocally everything is, but we have lots of, we know plenty of instances in which these are usually public with some potential exceptions.
So these are places where we've all obtained, there is a history of somebody getting public records.
And as far as, the emails, charter school board in New Orleans, we wanted to know what they were talking about. It turns out that they were emailing constantly amongst themselves outside of public meetings. So they were breaking the public meetings law, which requires them to speak in public. So we were able to get all those emails, even though they're sent to their personal accounts. They gave us all those emails, and we were able to see how they were trying to fight this teachers union. And so that was a good way that we did it. On these, we've had, so here's another list, I would say, tax liens. You would be surprised how many people run for office and have outstanding tax liens from the IRS. we've done two major stories at the Lens about people were running for mayor and the IRS had a lien, which means they have made a claim on their property in their home because they haven't paid all their federal income taxes. So you'd think you'd get that cleaned up before you run for office, but it's out there, it's available to get at the courthouse.
And we're happy to make this slide deck
Yeah.
available to you guys so you don't have to scramble to write notes.
I do know that in some states, parts of personnel files aren't available. I've worked in states where the entire thing is available. Sometimes disciplinary stuff is or isn't, but in general, public employees, certainly their salary and date of hire and the most basic elements like HR stuff, and then sometimes it's even deeper than that.
And if you belong to a public university, that should also, the salaries of everybody at that university should be available.
Yeah. And then we get to inspection reports and audits. There are so many different kinds of reviews that are required by different laws. So many, let's say $10,000 was given to some agency to do something on behalf of the government, let's say to help with animal control or something. There's typically an audit that's done of that spending so that they can send that to the state. Agencies have to go through regular audits that they flag all kinds of financial issues. And then there are other kinds of just inspections, everything from restaurant inspections, all kinds of regulation. If there's a regulation to do something, there's often some sort of inspection that's required to follow up on that. So when you understand the system, you'll be able to understand what sorts of records are available. This link goes to the nonprofit tax forms. There's a lot of good information about nonprofits on those. That's a record that they're required to make public. And then when you run for office or you have a position on a state commission, there's usually some kind of form that you have to fill out that gives some indication of where you get your money. There's not a lot of detail on them sometimes. Sometimes they're called ethics reports. Sometimes they're called financial disclosures, but there's some kind of disclosure that's typically required. And if you want to get a better understanding of maybe where some conflict of interest lies or maybe some contract issue, that's a good place to go. And then when you go to a public meeting, typically the board members have a packet of information in front of them, right? So they have the agenda. You should get the agenda in advance, but then they have all this other stuff that they've been given, and all of that is available to you. It should be available to you at the meeting, but if you can't get it right then you can send a request for that. And if you're doing this work regularly, your sources will know that you're going to want that in advance anyway. So there are cases in which you're on the mailing list. They send you the entire board packet before the meeting because they know that's something that you're interested in. And then sometimes minutes and documents from closed sessions are available. If there's some sort of executive session that keeps you out, then maybe you can get that sort of thing. So any questions so far about what we've discussed?
Does public necessarily mean free?
Typically, it is free to view. So I don't know of a case in which you can be charged to view it. The state law varies. Sometimes they can charge you for the staff time to collect it and get it together. Not in Louisiana, but in some states they can. I'm pretty sure that's not okay in Florida, and they couldn't do that in Texas either. That's why later you always want to ask to see documents. First off, it's one of the best things you can do as a reporter is to walk into a government office and sit down at the desk and just going through their stuff. I think it really makes the point that that they're working on behalf of the public. But you would be really surprised by all the things that are supposedly responsive to your requests that are just not useful. So you could end up paying for lots of copies that were not useful. Anything else? Okay.
So some of the basic things to keep in mind. First of all, when you're looking at public documents, you want to make a request in advance, often. And in order to obtain that, you want to know what the records retention schedule is. So you can often call up a state agency, and one of the first things you need to know is what are the rules for them holding those documents. Let's say you're looking at the driver's license or driver's record for some coach. You wanted to go to the Department of Highway Safety and ask for the driver's record. Well, how far back do they go? And what form does it take? So you want to ask, what do they have? What is the body of, what kinds of documents do they have, and what shape do they keep it in? And how long do they retain them? There are some state agencies, for example, that don't keep email records past a certain amount of time. Many also interpret things like iMessages, text messages, as something that's transitory. So they only keep it if it's still on someone's phone. And so that's where the range of interpretation goes. So before you ask for something, in order to make sure they're not going to drag it out, you want to know the scope of the retention, the records retention schedule. Another thing that I think is really important in this age of electronics and digital communication is you don't really want to get documents in their paper format. They're impossible to search, you can't download them. So obviously the thing to do is to always ask for them in their native electronic format. And that way you get they won't turn everything into they shouldn't be turning everything into a PDF or something that you can't use with ease without having to convert it. One of the other things is that they will often say they need to redact personal information, dates of birth, anything, Social Security numbers. So you want to know how they're going to do that. There is redaction software that more and more governments are using, but many choose not to use it because that helps them delay, and it takes a long time to actually go in and redact something, even if it is an electronic format. So you want to ask, how do they handle their redactions? And as I mentioned, know the law. Depending on what state you're in, legislation will often change. And there should be a Secretary of State or some other place where that's a central source for this information. And this is a point that Steve can talk about here.
So when you're making one of these records requests, one of the primary mistakes I've seen is that you don't ask for a record, but you ask for information. So government agencies don't have to answer your question. So if you want to know how many teachers went on a field trip and you file a public records request and say, I'm filing a public records request, I want to know how many teachers went on the field trip. They'll reject you, and then they'll say, you haven't asked for a record. Sometimes they'll say there are no documents available that's responsible to this. So what you want to say is you're looking for records that reflect the names of teachers who went on the field trip. You're always talking about a thing that exists. So you have a question in your mind about what you want to get, and you need to be able to translate that into whatever records the government agency keeps that would answer that question for you. Sometimes they're going to be nice and they'll just answer your request, or sometimes they'll create a spreadsheet for you. And I don't want a government agency to be creating a spreadsheet for me. I want to see the actual original thing that they're using to do their work. If they create a spreadsheet for me to answer my question, I want to know, I would come back and say, I would like the thing that you used to create that. That's what I'm interested in getting. And sometimes they'll think that you're being hard or you're being stubborn, but that's actually how you find out really what you need to know, not by having them create some new thing for you. And there is the reality of all this, which is that it's actually pretty hard oftentimes to get people to respond to public records requests in the way that they're legally required to. Many of these employees are overworked. Their agencies haven't been, they've been cut or haven't been increased in years. Answering public records requests is on top of other things that they do. In some cases, you will be the first person to ask for a document. So if you are in a rural area, or if you're dealing with an agency that is just so far outside of what people pay attention to, some sort of economic, let's say an agency that like regulates ferries or something, and they're like, no one ever deals with them. So they're not going to be used to people asking. And then they might not really think it's their job. They think this is an addition to their job, but actually it is part of their job. And if you go and read your state public records law, the first page of your the first part of the statute is usually some sort of very grand statement about how important it is to have the records be open. And that is usually a good way to respond to that, to say that this is actually part of your job. Okay.
So I don't have the specifics on this because one of our managing editors ran into this issue, but we were trying to get some court documents in which they said we would only be able to get them if we drove 40 minutes to the actual courthouse, and that, like going back to a previous slide that you had up, asking for them in the native digital format didn't work. So is that just something where we might have requested the information wrong, or have you ever heard of something like this happening where you could only get them in person?
Well, was this a court document?
Yeah, I believe so.
Well, part of them, that may be if they have it electronically, they should be able to transmit it to you electronically. However, there may be a cost associated with that. So that, I guess, I don't know what the context is for that. There are still, believe it or not, and Florida actually, it wasn't only until a couple of years ago that they required all court documents to be filed electronically. But it took, 20 years since the digital age for them to get to that point. So it's very possible, depending on what state you're in, that courthouse still gets things in paper format. And in that case, they probably don't want to be making copies for you, so you'd have to physically go there. And sometimes they'll let you make the copies on a machine, and you have to physically take the time to do it. That's where you need to be talking to, to the source and say, what can we do to get this? And it sounds like they do want to make it. So they want to create hurdles because it's a hassle for them.
The other thing is that, the public records law is usually something that applies to the executive branch, and in the courts are, a separate branch of government, and in states where I've worked, they're not actually part of the public records law. They're their own, they have their own filing system. For instance, under public records law, you typically can make your own copies of an executive record, right? But in courthouses, because court clerks rely on the copying fees, that's part of their revenue, and so you literally can't, you get in trouble if you try to take a picture on your own. So the things that we're discussing here, court files are almost all, they're generally open. It's just that some of the things we're talking about here aren't necessarily going to apply because it's a different branch of government. So hopefully it helps.
It depends on what state you're in, though. Yeah. So if you're in the process of trying to find something from a belligerent source, let's say you want to get some email records, and this is one of the most important tactics to keep in mind is you just don't go to the mayor. You go to you also ask the mayor. You ask to see the mayor's chief of staff. Ask for the chief of staff's records as well for the same subject you're looking at. And then maybe anticipate who might have received those records and ask for any records that left from the extension, the city hall extension to that particular recipient. Find 3 or 4 different ways to request the same information if you think you're honing in on one source that you think you might be finding something. And the reason I say this is because too often there have been times in my experience where an email just somehow got left out of the batch. And it was only because we asked for records from the recipients and they didn't leave out the same email that we knew that there was a usually a smoking gun email. So sometimes you have to look at it like your triage and who else along the pipeline of the correspondence might have received that. And as we mentioned, when you're looking for data sets, you want to also be sure that you ask the agency for what are all the forms that they keep and what does the record layout look for them. A lot of times you'll be getting, like we have done a lot of projects on nursing homes, inspections of assisted living facilities, juvenile justice facilities, foster homes, that kind of thing. And so we want to know the complete menu of records that the agencies keep, and then find out what to ask for them. And then when you ask for the data, it'll often be in an alphabet soup of extensions. So you want to make sure that you've asked for the data layout so that you can interpret that and use it more effectively. And that's the other thing, is that oftentimes these agencies will have a manual or some kind of guideline that will lay this all out for you. It's almost helpful at the beginning of your exploration to start asking for those, because that might give you some ideas of how better to narrow your focus. We haven't mentioned this yet, but one of the really important things is that many agencies have somebody who's used to dealing with this, and they're often called the records custodian in law. And so if you anticipate you'll be working with one particular agency or one group for a set of records, get to know who's the person who's likely going to be the one that's releasing this information to you. And it's much easier to be nice and kind to these people than it is to be hostile and aggressive. So you want to find ways to work with them and ask them, what can I do? What's the most effective way I can get this information? How can I make this easier for you to get it to me? Especially if you're still in sort of an exploratory mode and it may be a little bit of a fishing expedition, you need all the help you can get at that point. And then one of the other things is if you have had to pay for records, if they've sometimes charged you an exorbitant amount, make sure you keep track of that and let people know when you write about it that that's part of your story, is the cost to taxpayers, and especially if they've made it built some hurdles along the way.
And does everyone understand this concept of a record layout? Do you want us to go into more detail? Does that make sense to you? It's okay if you don't. You get it? Because in databases, there has to be like a way that it's the document that describes how the database works, and that's the key to knowing. It's given that so much data is stored and records are stored electronically, that's really important, because otherwise you could ask for something and you get a bunch of columns and you don't know what the columns mean. You need the data dictionary, the record layout to be able to tell you that. Okay, so not only, this is really important these days especially, that not only do you want to get the records, but you want to be able to put them into your stories. So you always want to be able to link to documents when they're available online. Download them also, in case sometimes records disappear off government websites. Websites get changed, things happen, links break. And you should embed them using Scribd. I'm a big fan of Document Cloud. I think there are a couple examples later in here where I show how to use that. Does everyone know what Document Cloud is? It's a document sharing and analysis tool. So you upload a PDF and it makes does optical character recognition on it, makes it searchable, and then you can draw notes and highlight things just as if it's like a piece of paper, and then you can embed that in your stories. So so this is a receipt that we had. We wrote about a charter school president who was after we got an audit and we found out that there were some problems with credit cards, and so that we got all the credit card statements. We found out that he had been going out for really fancy lunches. This lunch cost $164. Almost every child at the school was poor enough that they got free lunch. So the school board president, on taxpayer dollars, was going out for these fancy lunches. This is a public record. We asked for everything. They did fight us. Took a while to get it. But in the end, we got all the credit card statements and all the receipts showing exactly his taste for crab fingers, and he had apparently a vodka too at that lunch. So, this is all paid for by taxpayers. Okay.
So as we mentioned, when you guys are making the public records request, you want to construct it in a way that it's going to get you as much information as quickly as possible. So you're going to find out what records exist. You want to make sure you draft it in a way as narrowly as possible, but you still want it to be broad enough to get what you're looking for. That's when you can even suggest in the records request, please do a search for these keywords. Mayor Calypso, Chief of Staff, Galaxy, whatever. Put names and specific things that you're looking for in there. And it's always a good idea to find the records custodian and send the record directly to them because sometimes bouncing it from one person to another really helps to delay you getting anything back. Sometimes there is, in many jurisdictions, they have to respond to you. In Florida, they have to respond within 24 hours. They've got to say, thank you, we've received it. They don't have to give you the documents, they've got to acknowledge your document. So know what that is, because if you don't get a response, you can use that as part of your leverage. And many states also have attorney general's reports that they've been asked to have an opinion on whether or not someone's browser history, for example, is a public record. And if those opinions are available online, you can search through them and get some ideas about how to construct your records request as well.
And they're also useful if someone, is saying, we can't give that to you. This is, you go to the Attorney General's website in whatever state you're in, and if they have an opinion on that, then you can send that back to them. And it has pretty strong legal weight. It's not as strong as a judge's opinion, but it's pretty strong. Okay, so what sorts of things to include? You should cite the public records statute. It's not a requirement in most states, but you may as well let them know that you've read the law, you know what you're talking about. The next two are related. If, especially with the federal agencies, you ask for a cost estimate, beforehand, if my cost will exceed whatever, please let me know in advance. That way you're not on the hook for a lot. But always, again, for us, ask to view the documents, and then often you can scan them yourselves. Include in this request, if you deny any part of this request, please cite an exemption in state law. Not just tell me why, because they say, well, it's private, and it has to be an exemption in state law. Sometimes they'll point you to a court case, and then you obviously have to go and look at that, but I never give them, I usually just say I want something in state law and let them come back to me with a court case.
We didn't include any links in here, but we can add them. But there's reporters' freedom of information, FOIA websites that have sample template records requests that you can use. That's a good starter for what you're thinking of. And so there's a lot of places where you can go to get examples. If you're in a state, Florida has a First Amendment Foundation, you can get a template for that state. I think other states have things like that.
And there's a website called MuckRock, M-U-C-K-R-O-C-K. It's a way, they help file public records requests, they post public records, and then they do stories based on what they get. So it's a great service. They're based in Cambridge, actually. And then if you're asking for lots of different things, you can ask to get the records in batches. I find that oftentimes they don't do it, but it's a way to try to help speed things up. So any thoughts about asking for things, constructing a request? Good? Okay. Denials. Okay, so one thing you may be told is that your request is too broad. So one thing that happens, you say, I'm looking for all records related to Airbnb regulation in New Orleans. Your request is too broad. That could be anything. So instead, I'm looking for meeting notes that occurred between, of the mayor's executive staff regarding the passage of the ordinance regarding Airbnb. Okay, so you can see how you narrow that in. You'd be amazed at how things change if you know the name of a record and you ask for it by name. That way they don't have to do their thinking. Like, oh, I know that it's called, the lead inspection report. I want all lead inspection reports. Then you can also limit to certain keywords or particular departments. So rather than going citywide, zero in on a particular department. I would say as much as you can take the thought process and interpretation out of fulfilling your request, the more likely you are to have an outcome that you can rely on. If you're told that it includes things that are exempt from disclosure, sometimes they say you can't get that because there are social security numbers and birth dates on it. But in pretty much in every state, there's a part of the law that says specifically it is their job to segregate, redact that information. But I have had lawyers who should know better tell me that, no, it means the entire thing is private, and you have to kind of come back on them. You would be very surprised at how many people in government haven't really been very educated on the public records law, and just really, it's like you may feel like you have to actually train them yourself. It's very common to get an initial denial. The point is that you have to sort of negotiate and keep coming back on it. And just remember in all cases that basically the presumption that is that the record is open. It's not your job to tell them why it's open. It's their job to tell you why it's not. So every time you go into a request, that's the mentality you should have. All right, we're gonna talk about some story ideas.
Yeah, so we've got a long list of these, and we'll go through some highlights and then give you some examples of stories that we've done. I think that one of the investigated areas often is contracts, government contracts. Not 75% of all government right now is outsourced to somebody, and whether it's the garbage collectors or the food vendors on your campus, there's a contract there, and those contracts are public records. It's the devil is in the details, as they say, because it's often the terms of the agreement. How often has it been renewed? What is the relationship between the person that's signing the contract for the government agency and the person and the government or the company that's been hired? There's just endless amounts of potential there for stories. Another place, of course, as Steve has found, is expense reports. Get itemized expense reports for people that you're reporting on. Make sure that you don't just get the general summary, that you get all the receipts, hotels, meals, all that stuff. Payroll records, that's another place to go. A lot of times people are accruing enormous amounts of retirement pay, bonuses, sick pay. If somebody leaves abruptly, a perennial story is how much money are they leaving with? They leave and they've got $500,000 in bonuses and sick pay accrued. And that's on the taxpayer dime. That's a good story.
So again, on payroll, you should always be able to get, the basics on payroll. And you may have seen salary databases. So at universities, at public universities, even posting, your highest paid employees, that's something that would be, that people would be interested in. At the very top of the chain, you often have employment contracts with coaches and presidents, and so those are things that you can get. Regarding legal settlements, sometimes a settlement is confidential in court. So they sign a confidential agreement and you can't figure out, the university was sued, let's say for some negligence, they signed a confidentiality agreement and they try to keep it from you. But the thing is that the records of the payments are not going to be confidential. So that agreement itself, that may be something between the two of them, but if you go to the finance office and you can request all payments made over a certain amount, or ask to see all payments made in a certain month, and eventually you'll be able to find whatever check was written, and then sometimes you can get the supporting document behind that. So I would say anytime you're told that a government agency has agreed to a confidential settlement, you should press on that, and you should be able to get that. Credit cards, again, those are very useful.
There's other places to go for stories. Obviously, vanity license plates. Every state has these. They're always fun. Every year they get enormous amounts of license plate ideas that they've rejected. Traffic and parking tickets. That's another perennial. Where are the ticketing hotspots in your town? If you're into doing some, you can put a map together. You can show. Who are some of the scofflaws at your school? Where are the hot spots where there's the most speeding tickets, that kind of thing. Also, if you live in a city like Cambridge or Boston where they have parking permits for residents, some people manage to get dozens of parking permits. And that is certainly a good story. What do they do with it? Do they use that to hand out to friends, that kind of thing? And states that have lotteries, which is most states right now, there's always great stories about the repeat winners. How often these winners are listed under a trust? Where's the money really going to? Are there certain places where you can buy lottery tickets that tend to be the most lucky? That kind of thing. Right.
And then, it's not just all about boring stuff. You have animal control, an entire part of government about that, and you can figure out, are there certain hotspots in neighborhoods where, they're going all the time, dead wildlife, they could have that sort of thing. Logs of complaints, interactions with the public, that could be an interesting way to find out how the public is interacting with an agency. And 911 responses are a deep, deep source of stories. At the Lens, we did stories about the police were essentially, they said that their response time had improved, But what we found is that their response time had improved partly because they had taken lots of calls and they had judged them to be not serious, so they had excluded all kinds of calls, and in that way they were able to make their numbers look good. So if an agency is being measured on something, then that's what's important. Then there is often some sort of impetus to try to, game the system, and, there will be records related to that. So just 911 records in general, there are lots of different things you can do with that.
One of the things I wanted to highlight is campaign finance logs. Everybody that runs for an elected office usually has to disclose where they get their money. Don't just look at who's giving them the money, look at how they're spending the money. I just started to dig down into a state senator, and I started seeing that there were all these small expenses, $3,000, $4,000 for some young women. I looked them up on Facebook. I found out they were FSU. They just graduated from FSU, and I kept digging in the social media, and I found that they were, Playboy models, Hooters waitresses, and they were political consultants. So I called them up. I said, what kind of political consulting work have you done for Senator Artiles? And they were sort of not too sure. Well, so I gave them the benefit of the doubt and then kept going. And by that point, it was looking bad for Senator Artiles. He was already in hot water at this point. And as soon as he knew I had this story, plus, he'd also spent the money going to the Kentucky Derby and Key West with these same political consultants. And we told him we were going to write the story. He resigned the next day. Also, as Steve mentioned, there's routine audits that, every state agency are often schools that kind of have to have some kind of accountability audits. Well, a lot of times it's a good idea to go and look at those. This was in the middle of hurricane season when a routine audit came in front of me, and I started reading it, and basically the auditors were saying that Florida's emergency management system was not prepared for the last hurricane we had. And all this detail started coming out, so it was just a ready-made story.
I'm going to go into a little bit more detail about how we use this at the Lens. And so we came across an audit for a charter school, and again, this is done for all the charter schools in New Orleans because they're all independent groups. They all are their own, have their own finance offices. The audit, there's a reason to read the whole audit. Okay, you don't want to just read the first part where they say, everything looks good, because in this case the audit was fine, but they did have a part where they mentioned some areas of concern. And then usually what happens is they'll mention the area of concern, and then often there's a response to that sort of thing. So here are all the different things that we found in this audit. That they were tracking money that they said was owed to employees for vacation time, but apparently they're not supposed to pay people for unpaid vacation time. They randomly selected some transactions to review. They couldn't show that the contracts had been approved. They had other issues where they couldn't find, they couldn't prove that the thing that they said they bought, that they actually had it, and other times that they couldn't show that a purchase was for an actual school purpose. And then we have the credit card policy that said it was to be used at the discretion of the board president. And then, they found that some of the charges lacked receipts. So all of these things, we wrote our initial story on this, and then we went back and we started asking for all these different things. That's how we got the credit card information. So we found out that the charter board president spent $1,500 on these fancy lunches, and he was claiming that they were all for board business. No other board president in the city had a credit card like this. And you get great details, right? That he had a Long Island. He put a $40 tip on a $75 bill. He loves rock shrimp and lemon butter sauce. These are the details that make a story, and he's never going to tell you what he had at these lunches. Here's another one we did in a similar way. We heard that this charter school had gone on an all-staff retreat to a casino in Biloxi. So we eventually got the documents that showed that they had spent $70,000 on this. They had all these, they booked rooms for everyone. And again, the details. They ate ribeye steak, garlic roasted shrimp, and bread pudding with warm vanilla sauce. They attended training sessions, saying the the heading of the seminar, how much it costs to get a power strip and a projector. And then, of course, we got other public records that showed that they had cut employees' pay by almost the exact same amount that the retreat cost. So this was a huge story. This was really damning for that school.
One of the other things is if an agency if you're asking for some documents for an agency and you know that same information is available somewhere else, it's helpful to be able to use that against that. We were looking for some nursing home documents from the state of Florida. They gave us the one on the left that was totally redacted. All these important things were redacted, and I was able to pull down the very same document from Medicare and Medicaid website. It didn't redact anything. So we went in and started looking at all the places where information that was posted by the state agency for Floridians to see was redacting giant swaths of information that if people would just look at the federal level, they couldn't, they'd get the same information. And we wrote a story about it and they changed their policy.
How do you feel ethically about trying to read through the redaction marks? So I've had some journals and professors who said that sometimes they could just hold it up to the light and see what had been redacted in it. Should you still use that information?
Actually, we've had the Parkland, I don't know if you guys remember that Parkland story about there was some documents accidentally released by the Sheriff's Department in after the Parkland shooting, and they didn't redact it, and they reported it anyway. It showed that they were redacting things they probably should not have been redacting. So now the whole point of redacting is protecting certain people's privacy because there's a legal obligation to protect them. But I think there is value in being able to see through it because then you can raise questions about it. So I think it may not be a story on their own, but it certainly gives you cause to go back to them and say, this is what we saw. How come you're redacting that?
Yeah, I don't see an ethical issue with looking at it. I'm not saying I would definitely report it. We have had plenty of instances in which schools have given us documents and they didn't redact everything, and so we on our own, Document Cloud has a little redaction tool in it. So it creates a black box over it and then it reprocesses it so you can't see past it. So we have done that. And sometimes we've redacted things that really aren't exempt from public disclosure, but we just don't want to really freak anyone out or get anyone riled up about it, so we've redacted things on our own. But those are cases in which we got it from the agency and then we on our own decided, do I need to put this, parent's cell phone number, maybe we just cut it out because, what's the point?
So we were doing a series of stories about an inmate that was scalded to death in a Miami-Dade prison. And we started pulling all the documents and realized that the agency was very aware of problems that there had been in this particular shower. They had they turned the hot water on super hot. It looked like a setup and there was a cover up. And so we'd been trying to get as much information as we could. We finally got a audit or an inspector general's report back. And as we were paging through, and this time they didn't give it to us in electronic format, they gave it to us in paper. As we were paging through it, we started seeing a couple of these handwritten memos. And it was basically the state's inspector general writing a memo to the governor's attorney general, basically saying, we can't sit on this anymore, we need to release this information. And all we could conclude is that the inspector general really wanted us to see that she was being forced by not the attorney general, the governor's general counsel, to not turn over this information. But if we hadn't looked through every piece in the 500 pages that we'd gotten, we maybe never would have found that handwritten note that I think she never admitted to sticking it in there, but it did it became a really important story for us, but, you know, I'm pretty convinced that they wanted us to see that. So when you get documents, be sure you look through everything.
And look, turn every page.
Yeah.
So here's a fun story. We were reporting on a city commission that handled payroll rules for city employees. And we were reporting about how the president of a local university, Loyola University in New Orleans, was sort of doing the mayor's bidding on this. And so there were a bunch of documents that we were using. It was all public records that we were using to get this. After we wrote one of these stories, this is not one of our stories, this is from an Associated Press story. So apparently after we wrote one of these stories, he sends a message to the someone who works for the commission and says, I just discovered that the Lens is housed on our campus. I think they just earned a rent increase. So he sends that to the city, and he's obviously wasn't thinking through very clearly. And so later we got this message. And in the end, in fact, we were kicked off campus because they gave us another reason. But when people wanted to know why had we lost our office, we said, well, we don't know, but we do have this document that that we received, so maybe that's part of it. So you see, people are really, when you email and text, I mean, it's like you're talking to someone, and you can really get some amazing details. You get incredible access. And then sometimes when you seek records, the fact that you can't find the record is the story. So in this case, the mayor of New Orleans says, we're going to put more traffic cameras out. These are the cameras that send you a $150 ticket every time you turn right on red and don't stop for a red light. So, but safety is the reason. It's not because we want to make money, which they do, but it's about safety. So we asked for any records on safety studies that they had been able to provide, and they kept giving us other things that were not related to safety. And in the end, we were able to write the story that says that they have no evidence right here. There's no evidence that the cameras reduce wrecks, although they do have data on how many tickets been issued and how much money they had. They had like one study that actually supported the opposite case. And then we also found that in the contract it says that they had to do a report on all the proposed locations. They had never received any reports. So the story was about how you're being told this thing, but literally there's not a single thing that the city has that says that's the case. And as we were writing the story later, we found out, as we were getting denied, they initiated a study on safety as we were asking for this. So we published our story, and then 6 months later, they came up with a study saying, okay, well, here's why we think it's safe. So that's
Okay, this one is another example of how the audit reports were coming out about the Florida prison system, and it was clearly a whitewash year after year after year. And the reason we knew this is because we had after we started writing some initial stories, we had some people in the prison system who had been longtime inspectors who were coming to us as whistleblowers, and they were willing to tell us, this is the kinds of stuff we've been finding. So this was probably 6 months into our initial reporting on the Florida prison system, and people started coming to us. But that's when we knew that the agency there was a contradiction in, as Steve was saying, what they were saying the situation was in Florida prisons and what they knew was the case. So the audits in this case were whitewashes, and the way we were able to show that they weren't is that these inspectors came up and told us about the things that they saw. So it was just sort of sometimes when you write, if you show that you're interested in an area and you start digging, there are good-hearted people that want you to know more, and those are the people that help steer you. And oftentimes they don't want to be quoted, but they'll say, here are the documents that you need to be looking for. And if you ever get a source like that, try and pin them down for as much specificity as possible. What specifically should we be looking for? What's the time frame? What are the series of documents? That the most detail that you can get, the better.
Yeah, because sometimes they'll say, you should just do a public records request for this thing, and that's not going to do it. You need to really know as much as you can. That's great. It's a great story. Want to do cell phones?
Oh, okay. So here's another example. Hurricane Irma hits Florida, and the nursing home. There was a nursing home in Broward that lost power. 12 people died. 12 elders died because of the terrible conditions. And Rick Scott had been doing daily phone calls with all of the nursing home providers, because they were basically moving residents from one coast to another. It was crazy and insane. And he always was telling people to call his number when they were having problems. So what happened? Predictably, his phone becomes flooded and they don't check any of the messages. And so we asked for the phone. I mean, we did not know about this until somebody told us about these phone calls that were happening on a daily basis as the hurricane was approaching. And they told us that after these people had died, so we scrambled and finally asked for the documents, asked for the call records, not just of Rick Scott, but his travel aide, because his travel aide would often be getting the phone calls. And they were so big. I mean, the governor, this is the midst of a hurricane. He is not checking his messages. So what is happening? These calls for distress are going unanswered. And it just was the most insane story. So that's how this one came about. But it was just asked for cell phone records.
And you were tipped off that this was going on?
We were tipped off because people that were on this phone call say, but we've been told to call the governor. We're thinking, first of all, our governor doesn't even do emails. I mean, he has tried to stay off the grid so that he could not be caught by public records.
Right.
But so we asked for his phone number and his travel aid, and that's how we got this.
Okay. Back to the point about being candid in emails and notes. So there was a situation in New Orleans where the school system, after the Flint water crisis, the school system said, we're going to be proactive, we're going to test our schools to find out if there's lead in the water. And then a year later, we checked back with them, or maybe it was 6 or 8 months, I don't remember, and they said, yeah, we changed our mind, we're just going to install water filters. But they never really could give us a clear explanation why. And so we started doing some public records requests. We sent a public records request to the school board, and we also sent public records requests to another agency that handled the buildings, and then also to the water agency. The same request went to everyone. We got different records from everyone. So, there's different levels of rigor and record keeping in each one. And so what we found is that the city water system actually was arguing, raising all kinds of objections to doing this testing. And they apparently were not happy about the fact that someone was going to be independently testing. They even argued that more lead should be allowed in the water than the school system was saying would be okay. So the school system had one number, and the water system said, actually the EPA says this number is okay. You should be able to do that. And so they were advocating for twice as much. And the way we found this is there was one of the best documents was a file where someone was assigned to write minutes of a conference call, and it was all laid out. So-and-so said this. He raised this objection. So-and-so said this. And so what ended up happening is after the agencies went back and forth, the school system just dropped it entirely because they didn't want to get in the way. They had this battle over who was going to be testing and who's going to do the sampling, and they just gave up. And then we started to write about the fact that, then the water filters weren't being replaced. And even now, I think it's been about 2.5 years, only a couple of the schools have had these water filters installed. So it's just been a repeating process. And that is an instance in which they would not tell us what was going on, and we revealed through those notes what had happened. So that kind of gets us to the end. We're happy to answer questions, and you can also email us if you have any further things.
And if you guys have any situations that you'd like to kind of brainstorm about how to get documents, we're happy to try and help you figure that out.
Any further questions or thoughts? Sure.
Where can we access this PowerPoint?
Oh,
I can do a short link. What happens when you text something to that number?
Or we could have Samantha send it to you.
Okay.
Yeah.
To all the attendees. Yeah.
And we'll be sure to add for more information, like some of the FOIA places.
Yeah, Reporters Committee for the Freedom of the Press is the best one that I know. It has a state-by-state guide, and for instance, it goes into each. It has topical questions like can they charge me for copies and all kinds of wiretapping and that sort of thing.
Is anybody working on anything right now that you you're thinking maybe of getting documents for? Any,
I mean, I go to like a private college, so like it's a little bit different, but like we've been struggling a lot to get like financial records or like even pieces of the budget,
yeah,
and stuff like that, just because they've been raising tuition a lot for students and like obviously students wanna know where that money's gonna be going. And we've just been facing a lot of difficulty, just like a lot of like stalling, you know, like.
what school are you at?
I go to Emerson College, which is like downtown Boston.
So one of the things, whenever you run into a hurdle like that, think about where else you can go. So there is probably a public agency that interacts with Emerson, and Emerson has to make reports to them, perhaps maybe to get foundation money, maybe to get Title IX money. So it might be worth asking what other documents the federal government has about Emerson and their financial situation, that is a public record. So
just like trying to find ways to go around the
yeah,
administration.
yeah, go backwards. And I'm thinking Title IX might be one area. I don't know, maybe there's others. What do you
That's
think?
exactly what I was gonna suggest. I mean, if they're doing a big renovation and they say that the cost of the renovation has gone up, you know, a lot of those things will be on file with the city. If sometimes when you do your initial plans for a building permit, you have to give them an estimate of how much it's gonna cost and all the plans.
Using a lot of the city records for that. You know,
Also, if there's a foundation, we've got the 990 information that's available.
Yeah, at least in like what I have found is that the 990 information is like really vague.
Yes,
And it just gives
That's
you like
true.
really vague, like, you know.
yeah.
You know what I mean? So it doesn't
Yeah,
tell
it's
you
top
like
line.
exactly where this money is going.
And then if there maybe are some contributors to Emerson that contribute to the foundation, maybe it's worth interviewing them. What is their sales pitch?
Yeah.
Yeah, but that's true, the private schools are harder in that respect.
Anybody else have questions, thoughts? Yeah. Well, thank you for all being so attentive, and
Yeah,
good
good
luck,
luck.
and just know we'd be happy to help you, so,
It won't be easy, but you're gonna get some great stuff.
yeah.